starting here the week after Easter and for the next few weeks, I want to take us back to the book of Acts. As a church, we began the book of Acts months ago, and we left off at chapter 17. So I want to pick it up again and finish the last few chapters of Acts over the next few weeks. Really for this reason. I believe that the last part of Acts provides some really important lessons and some important encouragement for the church. And this is a time where I know I could use to learn those lessons, and mostly I need that encouragement. And I know I'm not alone. I think our entire community, certainly our entire church community, could use the lessons and the encouragement found at the end of the book of Acts. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 18 this week, and we'll just take it a chapter a week until we wrap up the book of Acts. So if you have a Bible or on your app or however you're doing it, turn to Acts chapter 18. As we get there, just really some summary of where we've been, and this won't take long. Paul is on his second missionary journey. And in Acts chapter 18, he's finishing this second go-around of taking the gospel to the world. And here's where he is right now. He's beaten. He's broken. He is worn out emotionally. And I think this is so relevant for us today because I believe as I'm speaking, there are many of you that this relates to. You feel that way. And if you don't feel that way, you either live next door to someone who does or you're related to someone who feels that way. And so I find this is really timely in its relevancy. And here in the first part of Acts chapter 18, God reminds Paul during some of his dark times that God is still providing for him. And that's such an encouragement. So I want to show us that the few ways that God is providing for Paul when he is feeling broken down, worn out. Okay? So Acts chapter 18, I want to start reading in verse 1. Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. One thing I just want to start by looking at in that paragraph is something I kind of just went by, and that is, it says Paul was a tent maker as he stayed and worked with Priscilla and Aquila. Why is Paul doing tent making now? That's my question. Why is he doing that? Tent making involves working with leather. So, the question, is this a new skill for him? Has he had this tent making skill, this leather working skill all along? Why does it bring up now that he's doing about it? We've never heard about him using this tent making skill previously. Well, unfortunately, the biblical answer is it's not clear. I mean, we're mostly left with speculation as to why he's involved with tent making now. But we do have some facts that can help us intelligently speculate. One of those isn't found in the book of Acts. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, that Paul is financially broke as he's pulling into Corinth here in the first part of Acts chapter 18. He tells us that. We hear he's coming in weak, afraid, and trembling. We know that the cities he's been to before this, he was threatened, he was physically beat up, and thrown in prison. And here he comes to a brand new city. What is he going to do? And we learn right away, he meets some people, some new people. Priscilla and Aquila are brand new friends for him, and he has a way of making some money. So I learned that God provided Paul a new job and some new friends at a time where he had no idea what was going to happen or what he was going to do. And the story of how Priscilla and Aquila got to Corinth is interesting too, because they weren't intending to go there. They were living in Rome and were content there. And then this violent persecution broke out against the Jews, and it said here in Acts 18 that Claudius ordered them to leave, and that's putting it mildly. Priscilla and Aquila had to go 750 miles away to Corinth, to a whole nother country, just to get away from the danger. Now, these are godly people, but I am sure during that very lengthy journey that crossed land and sea from Rome to Corinth, that Priscilla and Aquila weren't constantly saying to one another or themselves, you know, this is terrible, but I am certain God is going to use us to be more helpful elsewhere. I guess we had used up what we could have done in Rome, and so now he's forcing us elsewhere. He's allowing this persecution to happen so we can be more useful. Now, maybe they thought that once in a while, but I'm sure they did what all other human beings do when new circumstances that are very hard and trying present. What is going on? I am sure in the back of their minds, they believed God was using them, was going to do something through this, although they had no idea what or how. And as it turned out, they would end up helping out Paul. So here's my question, looking at just this first paragraph. How? Maybe has, but I'll start with how. How has God provided for you during this COVID-19 crisis? How has he provided for you with new friends, with new opportunities? It may not be a new job, but maybe it's some new skills or new chances to do things you've never done before, or maybe you used to do and you haven't done them in a long, long time. How has he provided for you with either new friends or new skills during this new crisis? But God's not done providing for Paul. This is just the beginning. Let me read verse 5. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, Silas and Timothy are familiar faces. When Paul first got to Corinth, he had no one that was familiar, and he met some new friends. But now, Silas and Timothy show up. These are familiar faces and friends for Paul. What a wonderful thing to be reunited with familiar old friends, right? But then it says, after they showed up, he devoted himself exclusively to preaching, which just means he's not tent making anymore. Why isn't he tent making anymore? We know from looking at the rest of Acts, he wasn't doing any tent making while he was a Jew and a teacher in the Jewish faith. He wasn't doing it then. He wasn't doing it after he converted and became a Christian. He wasn't doing it when he traveled to Ephesus and all the other places he went on his missionary journeys. You didn't see him doing this. So why did he start doing it? Well, he was broke. So if he stopped doing it, he is exclusively preaching now. If he stopped doing it, that must mean he's got some money. Now, there must be a connection to Silas and Timothy showing up, and now he doesn't have to be a tent maker anymore. He can devote himself 100% to his ministry. And that's true. Now, we don't see it in Acts chapter 18, but in 2 Corinthians 11, it explains and colors in more of the story here that when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, they brought with them a substantial financial gift from that church in Macedonia that Paul planted. Now that's a huge provision in and of its own for Paul. Because when he left that church in Macedonia that he planted, he was worried about them. He didn't know if they were going to make it or not. And now he finds out from some familiar friends that not only is that church surviving, it's doing well. And it is flourishing in its faith and its compassion and its generosity. Because there aren't big donors in that church of Macedonia. All those people just piled together what they had to send to Paul so he could be as successful in Corinth as he was in Macedonia. And so that has to be a great boost of confidence for him. And I want to pause at this moment and just say to those of you out here, the church is always needing stories of God's goodness and how different people are experiencing that goodness. We have got to do a great job at sharing that news. Now, I recognize that we're not meeting at McDonald's like we used to or around each other's dinner tables like we were, where we would just informally share these stories. Most of our interactions now are limited to the digital world. And that's okay. We can learn to make a 1-minute video, just sharing the story of how God has been good to us during this time in our life. We can find a way to type out 140 characters and just post it on social media somewhere so that other people hear. We cannot underestimate the value of these stories. Because during hard times, we are always wondering, are we the only ones going through this? And so I think some people are reluctant to share their stories because they don't want to brag. They don't want to seem like they're bragging, and they don't want to discourage anyone else's hard time by seemingly bragging about their good time. And as I learn about people in Scripture, specifically right here with Paul and Silas and Timothy, Silas and Timothy brought Paul good news, great stories of what was going on in Macedonia. Not because it was going to make him jealous, but because they believed it would encourage him. So I know there's a risk of seeming like you're bragging or something else. But to me, sharing that story is always worth the risk. So if you have a story of how God has been good to you throughout this crisis in your life, in the last month, please take a 1-minute video or a paragraph and just post it and share it. We need to hear those stories. Now, let's go on to verse 6 here. But when they opposed Paul, and that's a reference to the Jews. He said he was testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah back in verse 5. And now verse 6. But when those Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Paul said, I am strengthened by Silas and Timothy coming here and this financial gift and the good news. I am ready to devote myself entirely to talking to the Jews instead of the Gentiles. And you may ask, well, why them? Well, that's probably the hardest group to talk to. Because what he's going to be explaining to them is what they know is either incomplete or incorrect. And one of the hardest things to say to people is what you know is incorrect or incomplete. That takes the most energy to frame it in such a way that they might listen. But in my experience, people get most angry and most abusive when you suggest even that what they know might not be complete or actually might be incorrect. And so Paul, I believe, strengthened, says, I'm going to devote myself to them. And of course, what happens? They oppose him and are abusive. And he says, I don't believe he's angry when he says this. He says, look, I've done the best I can with you. I'm going to go talk to another group of people who aren't going to hear stories of incorrectness or incompleteness. I'm going to tell them things they've never heard before. And I'll just go do that. So he does that. But I don't know if you saw this. It says Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his household believed. That happened after Paul left. So Paul planted some seeds. He was lovingly trying to warn and serve that group of people, and they got violently angry with him, and he left. But somehow that seed of the gospel he planted made a difference to at least one guy. And it was the most influential leader in that place. And it didn't happen because Paul stayed there and continued to talk and talk and talk because they didn't like Paul at all. But something happened. That is such a good reminder to me that I don't have to have control over everything all the time. Sometimes God just wants to use us to say one thing or to offer one idea and then move us on. And hopefully we will move on without proof of success, knowing that God has all the power he needs to raise that seed up into fruit. And that's what happened right here. But really what I wanted you to see is that it started bad. When Paul started devoting himself entirely to the Jews, boy, it started bad, but can you see the improvements? The Gentiles welcomed him in. In fact, the synagogue leader, Crispus, and his family started believing, and many believed and were baptized. So it started rough with abuse and then ends pretty well with many believing and baptizing. And that's important as I read verse 9. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. Why would God warn Paul and tell him, plead with him, don't be afraid? Why would he have to tell him to keep speaking? Clearly what he's doing is successful, even in ways he didn't think it was. So what is he afraid of? What is Paul afraid of? So much so that God comes to him in a personal vision. Again, it's really hard to see right here in Acts 18, but if you look back throughout the previous chapters of Acts, you'll see that when Paul was speaking in a place and people began believing and getting baptized and lives started getting changed, when that happened, the attacks on Paul really increased and became exponentially more violent. In fact, some people stoned him and tried to kill him. But not until people started believing what he was saying. Because anytime there is successful change in a place, it will always raise the level of violence and resistance and attacks. Now, it may not happen physically, but they will happen, especially when change and new life starts to come into a place. And that's what happened in Paul's past. So as many are believing and being baptized, it makes sense to me that he's afraid. Because based on his past, when that happened before, people started attacking him and stoning him. And God knows this. The people in Corinth probably don't know this, but God knows this about him. And he comes to him personally and comforts him in a vision. And he says in verse 10 to Paul, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. God promises his presence, his spiritual presence for Paul, and he promises Paul social presence in the form of other people. And I love reading that because it's, again, another really great reminder that we are never as alone as we feel. And I don't know about you and how you've mentally processed this whole isolation, stay-at-home, quarantine stuff. But sometimes it makes me feel alone. I'm not near as alone as other people. And I'm not near as isolated as others. But even in my own mind, I needed the reminder from Acts 18, verse 10, that I am never alone, near as alone as I feel and I think I am. That there is a loving God who sees things that only he sees. He recognizes them, provides promises to help me through them. And sometimes that provision takes the form of other human beings, if I will recognize it and allow it. Well, as I conclude here, I want to share a story. And it's a story about my youngest son, Dax. Dax, for especially the first part of his life, was terrified of the swimming pool. Really of all water, but definitely the swimming pool. And my wife, Brooke, spent dozens and dozens of hours at swimming pools just trying to help him conquer his fear. And that experience probably helped many lifeguards resign as well. Because Dax would just scream and scream, and it got a little better each time. The patience my wife had with him during that whole thing is incredible. I cannot praise her enough for that. And I was at the pool one of these times, and it was long after Brooke had done a lot of helpful work with him. But he still wasn't jumping in. And we were at the pool, and his big sister, Naya, was there. And Naya's never been afraid of the water. She's been a great swimmer and just never afraid. And they were on the side of the pool, and I told Naya, they were there together, Dax loves his big sister. He loves to shadow her. He's looked up to her his entire life. And Naya's on the edge, and I just back away from the edge and say, hey, Naya, see if you can jump to me, and I'll catch you. And I backed away to make it a challenge. And so Naya looked around, and she ran and jumped, and thankfully I caught her. And we laughed and splashed a little bit. And then Dax said, hey, I want to jump, Dad. And I had never heard this before. So I got close to the edge. And I said, okay, buddy, I'm ready. I'll catch you. And I mean, you could just see inside of him the tension of, I want to do this. And I'm fighting this primal fear that's been there from the beginning. But something that day overcame his fear, and he leaped into the air, and thankfully I caught him. And we laughed and laughed, and then we did it again and again and again. And I am sure I'm not the only parent that has this story. But my point with this story is Dax saw his dad provide for his sister, and so he believed his dad would provide that safe catch for him. So as we looked at Acts 18 this morning, my goal was that seeing how God has provided for one of his servants, even in some of his darkest and unfamiliar and unsure times, as he's traveling to new places and doing new things and experiencing all kinds of new stuff, seeing God provide for him, my hope is that you would see and believe that God will provide for you. Because that's the kind of God he is. That's the God we worship. He loves to provide for his children. Sometimes it's actually us watching God provide for a brother or sister that helps remind us that that's what he wants to do for us as well.